Thanks, Christoph. It's great to be here. I've had some conversations with some of you so far. I've met some of your colleagues in the film, which was great. And as Christoph mentioned, I'm a journalist. So in a sense, in radio and more recently in a book, my job is to tell stories. Well, in fact, my job is to collect stories and information and share those stories with as many people as possible. And I was looking at the Ecotone sustainability strategy, and there were some words that really stood out, including that sense of responsibility about future biodiversity and also fighting the standardization of food. And in a way, the last 15 years of my career has been trying to do exactly that, which is to fight the standardization of food by telling stories. And I wanted to share with you how that happened and why I think telling these stories is increasingly important. So I have a Sicilian connection. My dad is from the island in the southwest, and it's a place where they grow oranges. And when I joined the program I work on at the moment for the BBC, the food program, and they said, which story do you want to tell first? I panicked and then thought, the only thing I do know, and this was February in 2007, it was the citrus harvest. So I said, I want to go to Sicily, travel, tell this story of 1,000 years of cultivation of citrus, how it shaped the island, its culture, its landscape, palates. And arrived and ended up going to Etna to tell the story of the blood oranges that grow around the volcano. But as soon as I arrived, I was hearing stories from farmers telling me it was the last harvest they were going to have. It was no longer economically viable for them to grow, to harvest, to then transport the oranges. And there was somebody during that recording I was doing who traveled down from the north of Italy and told me that these oranges and what was growing around Etna was so important that they should be added to the Ark of Taste. And I didn't know what the Ark of Taste was. And they said, well, it's like the Noah's Ark of Taste. So slow food in the 1990s in Italy, so concerned were they about the standardization of food and the disappearance of regional crops, plants, animal breeds. They created an online catalog to tell the story of what was disappearing. If you tell the story that they believed, people can take action, do something, become engaged. And so I then traveled to an event called Terra Madre, which happens every 2 years in Turin, in just keeping the Olympic reference going, in the former Winter Olympics venue. And there, thousands of people from around the world gather to share stories of what was disappearing in their part of the world. And I started to collect these stories. Because in the Ark of Taste, there are now more than 6,000 endangered foods from more than 150 different countries, covering every food type imaginable. So for me, I was coming across stories of types of wheat that had been in continuous cultivation in parts of the world for 6,000, 7,000 years. There were nuts that were prized and helped sustain Maya civilization in cities in Guatemala. There were stories of pig breeds in England that were rarer than giant pandas. And so for me, this was a treasure trove, and I told these stories on radio, and you can seek out some of these stories from the Ark of Taste. And for me, they were just fascinating insights into food history and tradition and identity and heritage, and I just carried on telling these stories. But I was still left with some questions. Were these foods just quaint traditions? Did they have a purpose for the future? Why was there so much diversity around the world anyway? Why was it disappearing? And why should we care? So I embarked on a quest. It took me 15 years of traveling different parts of the world to try and meet as many of the people as I could around the world saving these foods, adding these endangered ingredients onto the Ark of Taste. And one of the big questions I started with was, where does our food come from? Where does diversity originate? And it took me to somebody I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, Nikolai Vavilov, a Russian botanist, who in the 1920s and 30s was traveling around the world collecting seeds and also coming up with this concept of centers of origin, which then became an idea of centers of diversity. And if you look at this map, these dark shapes are where Vavilov, in the 1930s, had concluded that our food originated from these centers. So you see millets, for example, in South Asia. You see coffee in Ethiopia, chili in Central America. So I want to tell a few of the stories that stand out for me from this map of diversity. The story of where our food comes from, why diversity has mattered so much for so long and why it's under threat and why it's so important that we save it. So if we start off in probably the most famous center of origin, which is the Fertile Crescent. This is the place where some of the world's earliest farmers started to interact in a different way with wild plants and animals and embarked on this long, complex process of domestication. So they were interacting with grasses, which then resulted in what we have today in the shape of wheat and barley, and they were interacting with legumes as well. So this is resulting in the domesticated crops we have, including lentils, as well as all the other livestock that you see in this map, which include cattle and goats and sheep. This is also where the first cities start to emerge, and unfortunately, it's one of the most crisis-ridden regions of the world today. So I wanted to travel and go to these centers of origin, not only because that's where the story begins, but it's also because the length of time these crops have been in cultivation means this is where the greatest genetic diversity exists for any of these crops. And starting point was to head into the Fertile Crescent in search of the origins of wheat. And there I met some villagers in eastern Anatolia who had been growing a type of wheat called emmer, which many of you will be familiar with. When those early farmers in the Fertile Crescent started to interact with wild wheats, they domesticated them to produce grains, and the earliest forms of domesticated wheats were einkorn and emmer. So they're hulled grains. And this was the story of much of our food over thousands of years, that we had huge amounts of diversity of crops that were adapted to that particular part of the world, the soil, the altitude, the water supply. But from these riches of diversity, we end up with a huge reduction. In the case of Turkey, the wheat that I came across, called kavalca, represented just 1% of Turkey's wheat crop. So I was trying to figure out, why is it that this particular wheat in eastern Anatolia had survived all of this time? I spoke to members of the community, and they were talking about this emotional connection they had with wheat. For most of the world, wheat has become a commodity. It's a crop that doesn't necessarily travel with a story. For this community, it was their inheritance. And even the way it looked in the fields and when it was being cooked, and they eat it as almost like a pilaf, it had an emotional connection with them, for them. I also spoke to chefs in Istanbul who were sourcing this wheat as well, and they saw it as their responsibility to tell the story of this wheat to an urban audience as well, and to include it in their menus. But it was when I started to speak to the scientists that I ended up with a slightly different story that made me think not just about the kavalca wheat, but many of the other crops and the diversity we're losing around the world. So they were telling me that around the world, farmers are struggling in many cases because of the spread of crop diseases. There is this disease called Fusarium head blight, which is a sneaky fungal disease that somehow finds its way. It disguises itself to get into the crop and then presses this self-destruct button on the wheat so it can take all the nutrients. And there's blast as well, which is, again, reaping havoc around the world for farmers. And it turns out that these landrace crops, including caviljar, have genetic traits that have high levels of resistance to these diseases. So I traveled to a place just outside Cambridge called NIAB, the National Institute for Agricultural Botany. This is a team of crop scientists who are producing the future generations of wheat for conventional farmers in the UK and other parts of Europe. And what they're trying to do now is to take wheat back through its evolutionary history and use types of wheat such as caviljar because of the enormity of the problems we face with climate change. So quite quickly, I was learning from this story in Turkey, this was no quaint tradition, that this was something, a genetic resource that had been saved by a community that was having a major impact on crop breeding programs in Cambridge, in the UK, and would be a plant genetic resource that would be used for the future. Let me just switch to another one of these centers of origin, centers of diversity, and if we head to Central America and the origins of maize, which, as with wheat, it takes thousands of years of our ancestors interacting with plants, wild plants, domestication process, over vast geographical areas as well to create the maize that we would recognize today. So teosinte is a weedy plant that if you were to try and eat the seeds, you would probably most likely break your teeth. And also if you see some of the corn cobs found in caves in Mexico dating back 4,000 years, they look like half of a cigarette, like a cigarette butt. They're that small. These farmers were interacting in ways and selecting that created the foods that we have today. So these are unsung heroes, in a way, that over millennia, experimenting and selecting consciously and unconsciously. In Oaxaca, which is in the south of Mexico and is close to the center of origin and diversity, botanists were traveling to remote villages in the late 1970s to see what was left of maize diversity after a period in which there had been industrialization of Mexico's food system. And they came across the most bizarre-looking maize they'd seen. It was 16 feet tall, and not only that, it had aerial roots that stood out from the stalk of the maize. And not only that, it was dripping a mucus. Very strange plant. And the 70s into the 80s, 90s, 2000s, people didn't understand what was happening in and around this plant. And where it had been found was a completely unpromising agricultural landscape. Not particularly great soil, but this maize was thriving. And it was only in 2016 that a plant scientist from UC Davis in the US had the analytical tools to actually explain that the maize plant was feeding sugars to a population of microbes in the mucus, and in turn the mucus, the microbes in the mucus, were fixing nitrogen from the air and fertilizing the plant. A process that is more familiar in legumes, highly unusual in cereal crops, and this made me think how we are losing diversity that we barely even understand or recognize. Let's go to another center of origin and diversity. I carried on after my book, Eating to Extinction, was published, which is a collection of 40 stories of endangered foods. I carried on researching, carried on traveling, carried on writing. And when Food Policy magazine in the US, which covers big global issues, asked me to write a story about what I thought might be a future food or food for the future, I said, well, I think we should include something in this special edition about food, about millets. Millets, as you could see, were the center of origin domestication in South Asia, huge amounts of genetic diversity, and why is it a crop for the future? Well, India saw a huge transformation of its food system in the 19th century, 20th, and the arrival of vast amounts of wheat under cultivation. We saw last year the hottest temperatures on record in India, so hot that people were dying in the fields. I mean, it was becoming almost impossible to farm in some parts of the country. And not only that, the irrigation required for the wheat cultivation was compromised. It was, and also they were dealing with crop diseases as well. This year happens to be the United Nations Year of Millets, and that is the result of the Indian government campaigning or lobbying the United Nations to say we need greater recognition of millets, these tiny, tiny seeds. And one of the things that I then realized is that not only are the millets tolerant to lack of water or lower amounts of water, but also they are highly nutritious. And India has a problem of micronutrient deficiency, particularly in women, absence of zinc, iron, and fiber in many diets. And when a team from the US in 2019 did a calculation of what would happen if you replaced vast amounts of wheat in cultivation in India with millets, not only could you produce more food, but also you could resolve some of these nutritional problems in the Indian population. And so now there is a program underway to bring millets back into cultivation, and the government is using some of its subsidies to increase cultivation of millets. And for many reasons, it feels as if we are locked into a system in which we are carrying on with a reduction in the amount of diversity, genetic diversity in the way we farm. And partly that is because of the structural problems that have unfolded in the second half of the 20th century and onwards. And much of this is about the consolidation of power in the food system. So after the Second World War, because of some of the technologies and the science that was being deployed to feed the world, we ended up in a situation in which seeds are now mostly in the hands of just 4 corporations. 50% of the world's cheeses depend on the enzymes and starter cultures from one factory on the outskirts of Copenhagen, and huge amounts of dependence on a tiny number of animal breeds in the food system, whether that's cattle or pigs as well. But most of what I've told you so far isn't new. So this story of the concerns over the lack of diversity were being told in the 1920s and 30s by the scientist that I'd mentioned before, Nikolai Vavilov, who had traveled across 5 continents to try and save as many seeds as he could, believing that that genetic diversity would be valuable for the future of humanity. To feed the world, he believed we needed crop diversity. And as the agricultural systems were changing around the world, he wanted to save them. So he embarked on dangerous expeditions to all kinds of remote places to meet farmers, save seeds, put them into a seed bank in St. Petersburg. Nikolai Vavilov's story unfortunately ends in tragedy because he fell out of favor with Stalin at the end of the 1930s and ended up dying of the very thing that he was trying to prevent, which was starvation. He had inspired scientists so much that when the Nazis surrounded St. Petersburg during the Second World War, they were prepared to starve themselves rather than eat the resources they'd collected around the world, the seeds. And his story, his name, resonates today with botanists and crop scientists because of his personal sacrifice and that of his teams. But his message rang true, and many people use that diversity to produce more food, most famously Norman Borlaug during the 1940s and 1950s to try and create wheats that would be more productive and disease-resistant for poor Mexican farmers. He took some of the genetics from around the world, including a type of dwarf wheat from Japan, and crossed it with types of wheat from Mexico and the US, and came up with a new generation of crops that have shaped the world today. And as I said, that goes under the name of the Green Revolution. However, with these new genetics, it was a system that depended on huge amounts of fertilizer, therefore fossil fuels, and irrigation and other inputs. This resulted around the world in monocultures, and we see that not just in the cereal crops, but most famously, perhaps, also in the banana, which there are 1,500 recognized varieties of banana, but one main globally traded banana, which is the second globally traded banana. There was the Gros Michel, or otherwise known as the Big Mike, which ended up being confined to history effectively as a commercial crop because it was overwhelmed by disease, Panama disease. Because of the nature of the banana, which is a cloned plant, you take out the suckers of one plant and you can create fields of more bananas. Genetically uniform, and so therefore if a disease hits one part of a field, it can spread, there's no resistance. The same is happening with the Cavendish today. So scientists around the world are trying to figure out how do we save the cultivation of the banana and face this problem of a disease that is overwhelming it because there is no resistance. There were people very early on in the Green Revolution who were saying there is a serious long-term problem if we lose genetic resources. And this is an American botanist who in the 1970s, after decades of traveling around the world collecting seeds inspired by Nikolai Vavilov, published a paper in 1972 where he was saying these resources, by which he means crop diversity and seeds, stand between us and catastrophic starvation on a scale we cannot imagine. If we end up with crop failures, for example, in the 1970s, there was a big reduction in production in the Corn Belt in the States because of the genetic uniformity of what was being grown, and disease attacked that. Harlan was warning that we need to save biodiversity, crop diversity. And his message was picked up by another US botanist, a much younger one, who is named Kerry Fowler. And with those words ringing in his ears of the consequences of lack of diversity, he lobbied the Norwegian government to then create the Svalbard Seed Vault, which is a tunnel dug deep in the Arctic Circle, and that is the backup for the hundreds of seed banks that exist around the world, which hold fragile collections. When people ask me, well, how much diversity is there out there? It's very hard to tell, but what you can say is that in Svalbard, there are more than 200,000 accessions, collections, samples of wheat taken from around the world. And you can see the figures from the other crops as well, rice, 170,000, and maize, around 40,000. So Svalbard exists, but these seeds are being kept at a low temperature, and what's inside Svalbard is the legacy of 12,000 years of agriculture. What's inside Svalbard is the results of the farming around the world, my ancestors, your ancestors. The diversity that they created in their fields now exists in Svalbard. And it could be that when you tell this story to most people, they think, well, okay, this is a story for crop scientists, and it's sitting there, and what use is this crop diversity? Because we have a food system that is based around narrow genetics now. Okay, we're keeping it safe, but we don't know what to do with it. That is far from the case. This is a photo taken from inside the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome about 10 days ago. And what you see sitting here are representatives from 190 countries. And they are there to discuss something called the Plant Treaty. So all of the seeds that are stored in Svalbard and all the other seed banks and all the crop diversity that exists in different parts of the world, so valuable are they now that they've become a really important area of political discussion and dispute. So the people in the room are discussing how do we best conserve crop diversity, and also how do we use it? And there are countries with huge amounts of biodiversity who have, as in Mexico and Turkey, saved some of the crop diversity. There are other countries that want to use that crop diversity as well. So in the room, for example, alongside countries from the Americas and from the Middle East and across Europe, you have the seed industry in the room, and you have the fertilizer companies in the room as well. It's a very, very live conversation now about how these resources are going to be used in the future. And one reason is that when this plant treaty that governs the control of these seeds and how they're used for research, when this was ratified in 2000, it was very much about these seeds, this crop diversity will produce calories for the future. The whole conversation has changed now under the plant treaty. Those resources, those seeds, are now being seen as our options for the future when it comes to climate change, when it comes to lack of water, drought, when it comes to challenges with soil and public health. So as governments around the world are seeing public health budgets, the plant treaty is now discussing how do we use that genetic resource to try in future generations create food or breed crops that will be more beneficial to health, as with the millet story that I mentioned before. I just want to mention one other part of the political process, and this was the COP that happened last year in Montreal. Don't worry about the detail in this slide, but it's about the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was ratified by more than 190 countries. And this is the idea of how do we stop all kinds of biodiversity being lost around the world. A couple of really important points, because this framework is going to shape government policy and decisions, we hope, in coming years, about not only halting biodiversity loss, but actually regaining, recovering a lot of the lost biodiversity. Importantly, included in biodiversity is crop diversity as well. So they are recognizing all of those domesticated agricultural plants that they need to be saved. And not only that, they are also arguing, or not arguing, also included in the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, is the idea that this biodiversity needs to be used for future farming systems that are far more sustainable than the ones we have now. So at the very highest level of international discourse and policy framing with this GBF is the idea that we need to save crop diversity and we need to use it to create the future farming systems. Not covered in newspapers or in generating big headlines, but this should have a massive impact eventually if governments start delivering on this. There are some crops, however, that you cannot easily save in seed banks. One of those is coffee. And the story of the origins of coffee and the way coffee left the Ethiopian highlands around 1,000 years ago and ended up in Yemen, and through Yemen and the trade into Europe, and then the proliferation of cultivation of coffee around the world in the Americas, famously, and also in India, before a disease hit the coffee crop there. We were dependent on one species of coffee, Arabica. As I mentioned, disease hits coffee in the 19th century. India used to be a major coffee producer, wiped out pretty much by coffee rust. And so in the early 20th century, that's when Robusta really starts to come on stream as a second coffee that, as its name implies, is more robust than the delicate Arabica. Two species of coffee, but it turns out there are more than 120 different species of coffee, some of which were in commercial production right through to the 1950s and 60s. Why does that matter? Well, many of you will be able to think back to 2014, around that period, where there were vast amounts of production hit by coffee rust then. farmers' livelihoods devastated, prices go up, instability in the markets. And at the same time, there was a team at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew in London doing some modelling about what climate change would do for Arabica cultivation around the world, and it didn't look good. So in future decades, as climate increases, productivity declines, proliferation of diseases go up. So what do we do? Well, luckily at Kew, they have records of plants that botanists in the 18th and 19th century sent back to London. So talking about plants and seeds. And one of them was a botanist in the 1860s who sent to Kew a type of coffee called Stenophylla. Stenophylla supposedly was as delicious as Arabica, but also it's more resilient to diseases and more tolerant of unpredictable, kind of less water in rainfall. So, did Stenophylla still exist? Was the question that the scientists at Kew they were posing themselves. And they went in search of Stenophylla, and they came across one tree in a forest, but it's like finding one panda bear. You need two to reproduce to create the next saplings. And this is a picture of Aaron Davis and his colleague from Sierra Leone who actually did work their way through forests in Sierra Leone in search of that second tree. They managed to find another tree and plant it, and then they managed to get a very small number of beans that they roasted. And in London, back in 2019, roasted it for the first time, and in corresponding with the records of the 1860s, it's a delicious coffee. And now it's being brought back into cultivation in Sierra Leone, and it could be that in future decades, our children will be drinking Stenophylla coffee and alongside Arabica and Robusta. So it's a really live example of we need these genetic resources. We need this diversity that we lost. The last story I want to share with you also comes from the Fertile Crescent, and it's going back to that so-called Neolithic package that I showed you. And the humble lentil radiates outwards from the Fertile Crescent. And as with wheat, it's grown by farmers in different locations, different climates, and adapts and changes. And in southern Germany, they had a particular type of lentil, and it went extinct in the 1960s. One farmer decided that he wanted to reclaim this lentil because he hadn't just lost this genetic resource, he'd also lost a farming system, crop rotation. And also, this was linked to a certain type of dish as well that he remembered from his childhood. He contacted as many seed banks as he could in search of this lost lentil to see if anyone had been in Swabia decades before to collect the lentil, couldn't find any trace of it. Traveled to Russia, to the seed bank that Nikolai Vavilov had created in the 1930s, and it was there that he was reunited with his lentil. What a joyous photo, I think, of somebody who is being reunited with a lost, extinct food. But the story doesn't end there, because I think this idea now of grassroots movements and supply chains creating businesses that are viable, that people actually want this food as well. His story inspired other farmers in Swabia to start growing this lentil again, and it's fundamentally different to any other lentil you tasted. Delicious. His story inspired farmers in Sweden to go back through their food history to see, before everyone was eating so much meat, what kind of peas and beans were people living on? And they, again, came up with these delicious varieties that have been planted again. And in the UK, we have a company called Hodmedod's, who are basically bringing back from the brink of certainly extinction in a food culture, peas and beans, and what they believe is the future of our food. I don't know if anyone's around in the late 90s, early 2000s dance music scene. This is Andy Cato, who was part of a duo called Groove Armada. Don't know if that, yeah. So he ended up stopping that side of his music career, ended up in a farm in France, and became obsessed with food diversity and growing food. And then he realized the big challenge was not to really grow on a small scale and sell in a market as he was doing. He set himself the biggest ambition of all, which was to change the wheat supply chain. So he came up with an idea which is now called Wild Farmed. It's a network of farmers, I think relatively small, so around 70, 80 farmers in the UK and France. And they farm to a particular set of standards, so it includes organic farmers and also some conventional farmers. But there's an emphasis on bicropping, so there's a farming system that they are working to, where wheat and beans are cultivated together. High in species diversity as well. So this is a get-out for farmers stuck in this monocultural lock-in. And also livestock being integrated into the system. Okay, well, it sounds wonderful and idealistic, a musician turned farmer, creating this supply chain. Well, what impact? It's the first time in the UK that I've seen anyone attempting to tell a story attached to wheat. We just do not know stories of wheat and cereal crops, and this is exactly what Wild Farmed are doing in the UK. Their flour is also being used in this pizza chain called Francomanca, and Andy Cato's thinking is that if you can change that supply chain and it becomes an ingredient in something where the price the consumer is paying isn't changed fundamentally, but you are backing up a completely different agricultural system, that's a win. And this is a story, as I mentioned, being played out in the high street. And it resonates with me when I was reading about the sustainability agenda of Ecotone as well, that on a much bigger global scale, this is something that you are also on the same mission, effectively, as I see it. My last idea here is about, well, how do you tell that story to people who aren't necessarily interested in agriculture? Well, maybe give them the most selfish reason of all, and that's their own well-being. We are now more familiar with the idea of the gut microbiome, so the trillions of microbes we all host. The science tells us the more diverse our diets, the more diverse our gut microbiomes, the more beneficial to our physical and mental health. And also we know from archaeological finds, so when they dig up bog bodies where the stomachs are still intact, people thousands of years ago had seeds of 40 different plants in their stomachs. Diversity is part of our evolution. It's part of our food history. It's something that's disappeared in relatively a short space of time. And there's more science. Don't worry about the detail here, but this is a couple of papers published in the last couple of years showing about the soil microbiome. So this is evidence that the wheats that Norman Borlaug bred in the 1960s that then spread around the world, they have much, much less beneficial bacteria in the soil microbiome. There's something about the genetics of these modern wheats that is not as abundant in the soil microbes. And likewise, another test with the addition of chemical fertilizer, that also was proven to show how that diminished the beneficial microbes attached to the wheat as well. So I think the science is building and growing, both in terms of public health and also in terms of the future of farming as well. I think it's reasons to be optimistic. Likewise, this is a project being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation also funded the Green Revolution, interestingly enough, along with the American Heart Association. We've identified and we track around 120 chemical compounds in food. They are now trying to track tens of thousands of chemical compounds in food, which might eventually result in being able to say, a type of wheat grown in this system is very different to a type of wheat grown in that system. and also starting to explain to us the connection between the food that we eat and our health. But I think the most important points to make is, going back to the Green Revolution of the 1960s, it was a fundamental shift in the way the world farms and in the way the world eats. If we can make that change once, we can make that change again. And also, I know from my own experience, and I mentioned about these supply chains, and certainly in parts of the world where I've met producers who are bringing foods back, people want this diversity, and they want food that comes with a story. And that's why I think the book has now traveled around the world. And there is one thing that people often say to me when they read the book is, I had no idea. They didn't know this story of diversity. And I think it's one of the most powerful and beautiful lenses you can have to view the world and our food. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was a really great story, and in a minute we're going to do some Q&A with Dan. Before we do that, I'd like to ask you to stand up a little bit and talk to your neighbor, or in a threesome, around what have you... Just one moment. What is the one thing that you got out of this presentation? And on the back end of that, you may think of a question for Dan on anything that was unclear. So what's the one thing that really resonated after this presentation? 5 minutes, yeah? Thank you. That seems to work. So have a seat again. And you will hear this more often through the next few days. So you can get used to this sound. Thank you. So, is there anyone who wants to share either what is your key message that you take out, just as a comment to share with the group or with Dan, and or any questions? Alexander is walking around with some microphones, so please go ahead, Karsten. Yes.
Hi. At the very last of your presentation, you were referring to the Green Revolution and why can we not do it a second time? I was thinking the Green Revolution had some benefits to the very people who were acting, like greater yield, more money, etc. So, having that in mind, do you still think that is comparable, or do you see a direct benefit in shifting to the people who act, rather than just changing for the greater good midterm future of all of us, which of course is a good motive as well, but it's more directed by policymakers and other people who are hopefully not lobby too much. So yeah, that's my question.
Well, I think there is recognition globally now that something needs to change in the food system, and very much most of that is linked to the lack of diversity. So currently around $500 billion a year is spent in terms of global subsidies on agriculture. The Global Biodiversity Framework, ratified by all those countries I mentioned, one of the things that they've agreed to is to start to shift those subsidies away from the production model that we currently have. And also, a recognition that the food system obviously is producing lots of abundance of some foods, but is that the kind of foods that we now understand are beneficial to our health, which is why I think the millets story is so informative. And the FAO calculates there are between 10 and $17 trillion of externalities when it comes to the food system, everything from biodiversity loss, climate change, and also going back to public health budgets. So what I'm not arguing is that the whole world will be changed and we won't recognize the future farming systems around the world. But what I am arguing is, and I think recognized by people, whether it's the plant treaty conversations or the biodiversity framework, that we need more diversity in the system. And we are seeing examples of that wherever you look, and recognition by by governments as well. And I think it's the unavoidable truth that crop diseases, and again, sophisticated processing industries that can transform maize into a superficial type of diversity. We need to change that system. And I think the current COP, or the COP announcement this morning about obviously not as strong as many people would like, but the transition away from fossil fuels, that will dictate a different kind of agricultural system as well. So I don't see it as a kind of the green revolution and then something else. This is an evolution of the food system, and that evolution needs to have more diversity woven into the changes that we're making.
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, there was just a comment from some people in the back that it was quite warm. We have adjusted that now. Is it better? There's a few more seats here in the front row. But okay, good. Okay, go ahead, Romain, please.
Thanks for your presentation. So you are talking about change, but what we see on a worldwide level, we are using more and more chemical pesticides, treatments. So how do you see the future of biodiversity? Is it something possible? Are you positive about that?
Well, I'm positive for the reasons. So, I've included some of the evidence I think is significant when it comes to public health factors, but also I think the way in which we need to move away from fossil fuel dependent system. I've traveled and collected these stories and written a book which is documenting the history of where diversity came from and why it's disappearing and why we should care. I don't have all of the answers in terms of where we go from here, but I am inspired by a lot of the work that's underway, and I think for me, just one example of the wild farm, although on a small scale, it's a recognition that, this would have been unheard of 10 years ago. So I think there is a transition underway. I mentioned millets in India, the PBS, the amount of money that's spent on subsidizing food baskets in India now includes, relatively recently, for the first time in the history of the PBS system, millets. So I think we are seeing real change. I think diversity coming back in some parts of the food system. And yeah, I completely accept what you're saying about the level of dependence that still exists in the food system. But I think the evidence is building, and what we really need is greater consumer awareness to buy into this transition as well.
That's a good point. Thank you, Romain.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, we can produce different varieties, and this is really what we need. But thanks to your investigations, have you seen good examples of what the governments around the world are doing in order to promote and to ask people to change their way of eating, and instead of eating rice and potatoes, but really to move to millet, for example, or something else? Do you see good examples?
Yeah. Well, I won't repeat that. I've said enough about the story of India millets. I think one thing that's gone unreported in recent years is I think it's a $5 billion investment in the US into creating more resilient local food supply chains. Part of that is an investment that's taking place in local and regional infrastructure as well. And I'm not sure whether this has been inspired by greater global instability and the recognition that you actually need greater resilience domestically and also regionally. But that's happening, and that's significant. Part of that also, they are investing in things like farmers markets, infrastructure for farmers markets and training for market managers. Why does that matter? Well, I think markets matter because actually they are a showcase. They are an opportunity to expose people to a type of diversity they might not see elsewhere. So I think US. I would check out. It's very interesting things unfolding under the Biden administration recently in terms of local, regional supply chains.
One or two more questions. Yeah, go ahead, Amber.
Is it working? No. Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation. As you can imagine, we're all very much convinced here about everything happening. I think one of the key questions that, and swim work that we're working on at the moment, of course, is how do we make this relevant to the consumer? You touched base on this very quickly. And my question for you is the following. In your experience or in your studies, do you know any kind of survey or studies that links this loss of biodiversity, or if we recover it, link back to what kind of benefit would that be to health or to taste for the consumer? If I'm thinking very pragmatically, about the products that we sell in this company, and how could we make it easy for the consumer to understand everything we're doing and what is necessary to do?
I do think it's challenging, but I've included some stories in the presentation that do provide, I think, some evidence that that there is consumer demand for diversity. Marks and Spencer, for example, is a significant business in the UK, extremely influential, and for them to buy into and allocate shelf space to these wild farm products is a big deal. So I think the fact that there is now greater recognition of, I mentioned the gut microbiome, for example. So we have Professor Tim Spector, a medical doctor who is running a twin study in the UK, which is tracking 40,000 twins globally around the world and their health. That then led him towards more research on the gut microbiome and something called the ZOE project, where people are now monitoring the individual responses to different foods. And that, the level of awareness now over that type of science is incredible, considering it was pretty much unknown 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, I would say. So I think the conversation and the awareness, the information around the connection between what we eat and the impact that has on our health. And this is why I wanted to include the periodic table of food initiative that's underway in the US as well. These are not going to create impacts overnight, but they will, I'm pretty convinced, be creating impacts in the years to come. I think the science is revealing to us the impact of the food system that we currently have and the overproduction of types of foods that aren't necessarily good for our health, and what impact diversity can have on our health as well. So, this is a long game, and the science is taking a long time to deliver the evidence that we need. But I think the trajectory is really important to understand the road we're on.
And I think perhaps to add Dan to that is what did strike me in your story was the story on Turkey, and where people said that we have an emotional connection with this crop, with the food. For me, food is also emotion. It links back to traditions, it links back to family and certain related moments. So back to your question, if we can find a way to share stories in a more emotional way that links with the context that people are in locally, that's probably where you start to bring things home. And that has always been, of course, the bigger challenge to cover, There's time for one final question. Renaud, did you? I think you.
No, hi. So thanks a lot, Dan. It was very inspiring. I have a remark first and then a question. The remark is for you, but also for the colleagues not from France. Ecotone Foundation is supporting the Vavrilov Institute in France called CRBA. It's less than 10 kilometers away from our head office. So just for you to know that we try to push diversity through what we sell, but also through the foundation support. And my question is about the coffee. With the climate change, because we are in coffee industry, with the climate change, do you think that there is a way that one day Arabica could be cropped more in Europe? Because it's an amazing, activity for us. But sometimes we feel guilty of the travel of the crop from the rest of the world. So, do you see opportunities, or did you see some tests somewhere?
Well, in terms of cultivation in Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think. Tea is grown in the UK, for example, in small amounts, and I think, I think this. the world, the global relationship between humans and coffee is very much based around huge, plots of cultivation. I was in Chicago a couple of weeks ago speaking to a team of people called Dark Matter. So they sourced a lot of their coffee from Central America. And they were describing these amazing landscapes that people are going and hand-picking the cherries and incredible efforts behind the cups that we often take for granted. And they were saying, in their opinion, that a cup of coffee should cost $20. And obviously that is not going to, it's unlikely that we will have a world of coffee drinkers if that was the reality. But I think that's the problem, is the disconnect we have. I mean, very few people understand the realities of what goes into collecting and harvesting the coffee, and then the skills and everything that's involved in the supply chains. So at the moment, it is something that is operating on economies of scale, although there are obviously businesses that are sourcing it incredibly carefully. So I think, unfortunately, a future of coffee in Europe is highly unlikely. But what I do love about that idea is bringing people closer to the product and understanding exactly what is involved. And I think that's the fundamental problem with this story. And this is why I wanted to write a book and make radio programs, is to try and explain why diversity matters, because it is not a story that we are told, but we should all be invested in this. Because the consequences, and I agree with Jack Holland, I'm not saying in the next decade, but in terms of future generations of people, if we lose the genetic diversity within the food system, we are losing huge amounts of adaptation and our options for the future. And this is scary. And it's a relatively short experiment that we've experienced in 60, 70 decades of intensive, selective agriculture. And that, I think, is creating risk that most of us do not even know exists. And we are losing deliciousness, by the way.
Yes, that's another point. Thank you, Dan. I think we have to close it here. And then we wanted to, well, I will come down to you. Wanted to, yeah, well, whatever is easier.
Sorry.
We can't leave you, of course, with a nice set of products.
Oh, wonderful.
Under which, for example, the Ancient Grains Muesli, which source a wider range and diverser range of ingredients, so exactly to your story. And there's other lovely things like coffee and tea and all kinds of indulgence. So
amazing.
We'll make sure it comes your way.
Thank you very much. And I, when I was writing Eating to Extinction, thank you. And people were saying, well, what do we do? And how can change happen? And I must, this is a confession now. When I was writing the book, I wasn't aware of what Ecotone was doing. And now I can actually say, well, look at what Ecotone is doing.
Yes, thank you.
And these products as well. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.